Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm your host, Ali Ingersoll. It's Super Tuesday today. People across the state and country are heading to the polls to cast ballots in primary elections. Presidential candidates, hopefuls, and many of their allies have made stops in our state in the last few days during this final push leading up to today. My colleague, WRAL's NC Capitol reporter Will Doran, is here today as our guest to join us to talk about why all eyes are on North Carolina. Hey, Will, thanks so much for joining us.
Let's talk politics.
Yes, let's start with here at home. We've seen a number of people visiting North Carolina over these last few weeks and really several months. So who are some of the big names stopping by our state, and why are they focused on North Carolina?
Well, the two names left in the Republican primary are Donald Trump and Nikki Haley. They've both been here, visits to Greensboro and Charlotte. Vice President Kamala Harris also visited, and of course, President Joe Biden was here a few weeks ago. Now, he's actually not contested at all in the Democratic primary. He's going to be the only name on the ballot. So I think he's got that pretty much sealed up. But on the Republican side, we have seen the two main contenders here. It's a big, important state, and they're fighting for our votes.
What makes North Carolina a major player for these presidential candidates?
Sure. So, in a general election, we're a swing state, and we're also one of the biggest states in the country. So, not only are we kind of up for grabs for either side, but we're a big prize, for whoever wins. And, in the primary, too, if you can win a big state with a lot of people, that kind of gives you a momentum when you're heading into some of the primaries that are later in the year, coming up in May and, further on this spring.
So you just said the phrase swing state. For some people who don't know, what is a swing state exactly?
Sure. So swing state, can swing one way or the other. It can go either way, be red or blue in the elections. It's something that is, most states are kind of either heavily conservative or heavily liberal, and North Carolina is not. We're, I think, what a lot of people would call light pink. We tend to favor Republican candidates and go red, but the Democrats have also had some success here.
Yeah, talking about that, North Carolina has only voted for a Democratic president twice in the last 50 years. So first off, who are the two Democrats who they voted for? And second, with that, why are we considered a swing state?
Yeah, so we voted for Jimmy Carter back in 1976, and then starting with Reagan onwards, it was Republicans won every single presidential election in North Carolina until 2008, when Barack Obama won here. And we were actually the closest state in the country here. I think that kind of answers your second question. But since then, it has been all Republicans. But every year it's been really, really, really close. Like I said, Obama, we were the closest state in the country. I think in 2012, we were also the closest state in the country. 2016, we were close-ish. I think, Trump won here by about 4.5 percentage points that year. But in both 2016 and 2020, Trump did win North Carolina, but neither year he didn't break 50% of the vote. And so that just shows you how close we are, even though we do consistently vote Republican in the last few presidential elections, kind of starting with that year that Obama flipped it blue. It has been really close, winning without even 50% of the vote. So it's really, up for grabs for anybody.
In our career, we tend to move around quite a bit. And I think what makes North Carolina kind of a fascinating place to be is that we have some Democratic state leadership, and then we tend to go Republican, which I think is kind of fascinating here.
Yeah. You can look at the numbers and see there were thousands of people who voted for Donald Trump for president, but also voted for a Democrat, Roy Cooper, to be the governor. And, it's just there's a lot of kind of those old school Democrats who are a little bit more on the conservative side, but still, don't necessarily like the national Democrats, but, like their local people. And so you get these kind of weird mixed political results like that.
And I'm sure that's why people kind of these candidates keep their eyes on North Carolina.
Yeah. No, like I said, a very small amount of votes can swing races here. I mean, in 2020, we had a race that was decided by, I think, 400 votes statewide for Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. 400 votes was all out of millions.
So when you're telling people your vote matters, in that case, your vote really does matter, and it should really encourage people to get out and vote today.
Exactly.
So let's talk briefly about the ballot. You kind of brought this up early on. Joe Biden, the only person on there for the Dems, as we know. When you look at the Republican side of the ballot, though, there's going to be a number of names, but a lot of those players not in the field anymore. So the people who are on there, as you said, former President Donald Trump and former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley. So does Nikki Haley have a shot? Why is she really staying in this race?
Yeah, they've been dropping like flies on the Republican side. I think there are going to be 7 candidates on the ballot. People like Ron DeSantis, who's been out of the race for a long time. Tim Scott, some others, and that's because the ballots had to get approved months ago to get printed in time, and since then everyone's dropped out of the race except for Nikki Haley. Why is she staying in the race? I think that's a question a lot of people have. I think probably the big reason is because she's the last one left. And obviously Donald Trump is facing all of these different legal issues that he has, both in civil court, but mostly criminal court. If he should get convicted of something, I think that could really change the math for a decent amount of voters. Obviously not all voters, but for a decent amount of voters, there could be people who say, I'm not going to vote for someone who, convicted of a crime, potentially in prison, for president. And I think that is something that is kind of keeping Haley's campaign going, is everyone else has dropped out, and there, she's kind of banking on, this, okay, if there is a chance that, obviously Trump wouldn't drop out. I don't think anyone believes should he be convicted. But, should he lose some support, then, I think that's an opening for her.
Yeah, definitely very interesting. And these trials are going on as these primaries are starting to pop up at states all over.
Yeah.
We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back. So, Will, let's talk a little about history. What exactly is Super Tuesday?
It's a funny name. And North Carolina hasn't always had its primaries on Super Tuesday. We just recently moved here. So I think probably there's a lot of people who don't really know about this, but this is basically the kind of the big day for primary elections nationwide. There's, I think, 15 or 16 states that have their primaries here today. And, it's we're actually, I was looking at the list, we're actually one of the few swing states that has a Super Tuesday presidential primary. It's like us and Maine. That's about it. There might be one or two others that I'm forgetting. But for the most part, it's places like Texas and Oklahoma on the more conservative side. Minnesota, California are also going to be on Super Tuesday. So I think it could be really interesting to look at states like North Carolina and Maine and say, okay, how are these candidates doing, that we might be able to figure out, some of these other swing states, how it might translate to a general election. But I think, honestly, the more interesting thing might be to look at, like, how does Biden do in California? How does Trump do in Oklahoma? Among like these super red, super blue states that are their base. And, if they're losing a decent amount of support among the voters who you would kind of assume are their, most passionate voters, that could signal some trouble looking ahead to November. So, we'll be looking at both, the swing states like us here in North Carolina and, the non-swing states throughout the rest of the country.
So sort of like polling in an interesting way.
Yeah. A lot of times, polls will interview, 1,000 people, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people, election essentially interviews millions.
Yeah. Can you talk a little about what voter turnout sort of looks like for these sort of elections here in North Carolina and beyond?
Yeah, so primary turnout is never very strong. And it's a little odd because in some states you have to belong to the specific political party to vote in their primary, but that's not the case in North Carolina. If you're an unaffiliated voter, you can choose whichever party you want to vote in. So you can go vote in the Libertarian primary, you can vote in the Republican primary, you can vote in the Democratic primary. So people do have choices. If you're an unaffiliated voter, which is actually the biggest group of voters in North Carolina, and you're listening to this and not sure, you can make up your mind at the poll, which party you want to vote in the primary for. And, we often don't see huge turnout in the primaries. It really is kind of driven by the base, the most passionate people out there. But, that could also go to show, okay, if even the most passionate people in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party aren't as passionate as you would think for the presumed frontrunners, what does that tell us about the state of the race?
So what can we expect over these next few months? What will this look like? Will North Carolina remain a battleground state ahead of the November election?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it is just starting to heat up here. I remember in 2020, especially towards the end of the election, I mean, it felt like Trump was here every other week. It felt like Biden was here every other week. They were just really pounding the pavement here and in just a small handful of other swing states because, most states you don't really have to campaign in. You're either going to win it or you're going to lose it. But it's North Carolina, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. That's kind of who is going to decide this election. I've talked to Republican strategists who say that, they think that there is no path to the White House for Donald Trump or Nikki Haley or anyone on the Republican side without North Carolina.
Wow.
Now we've seen obviously for Democrats, the same is not true. Biden is the president right now, even though he lost North Carolina. But Republicans say just looking at the numbers, they think that if Trump doesn't win North Carolina, he doesn't really have a shot at the White House. So they are going to be pushing hard to make sure that he wins here for a third time in a row, should he get the nomination.
So incredibly important state, incredibly important for our people to get out and vote, and a lot of work ahead for you, Will. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. And thank you for listening to the WRAL Daily Download. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can find more podcasts from WRAL News at WRAL.com. Just search podcast. From sports to true crime, there are plenty of shows to keep you informed and entertained. Thanks for listening.